Welcome to renowned physicist Dr. Jeremy England, former professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Shavua Tov, Dr. England.
Shavua Tov. So today I thought it would be interesting to think about fruits a bit, I guess, because seasonally it's like maybe a little bit late in the game, but we just came through a season right before this. We're in Machon now, and not long ago it was the end of the New Year's holiday season in Sukkot, and this is the time of year in Eretz Yisrael where we have recently been having a lot of good rimonim, like pomegranates and figs, te'anim, and before that was kind of the season of the grape harvest. And now all of that is tailing off a bit, but it only for a few weeks now. And there is, I think, an interesting juxtaposition of those three fruits in particular in the Torah that leads into a discussion of how the Torah understands political order, and in particular, like what is the ideal of political order for Am Yisrael here in Eretz Yisrael. And maybe in particular, the question of how the political collective and its sort of centralization trades against individuality. And so we can jump into it from the text, but I'll just start by reading a pasuk, reading a verse, and then talking a little bit about what I think the verse is getting at. So, in the episode in Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, where Moshe sends scouts into the land of Israel before the people go in, and really they're going to have to wait 40 years before they go in, but at this time they're supposedly scouting the land before they perhaps are going to go in and start to conquer it. We're told, among other things, that when the scouts are in the land, that they go and collect some fruit that they bring back. So it says, "Vayavo ad nahal eshkol v'yichretu misham zmora ve'eshkol anavim ehad v'yisa'uhu bamot bishnayim o min harimonim o min hate'inim." And they came to the brook of Eshkol and cut down from there a branch with one cluster of grapes, and they bore it between two on a pole, and they brought of the pomegranates and of the figs. So they're in Eretz Yisrael at a particular time of year. And so maybe you could just say this is a random detail that if you're at the time of year where you're kind of just finishing the grape harvest, and maybe that's a time of year when you also expect to see some figs and some pomegranates growing. So they just grabbed some fruit from where they were. They wanted to bring back the fruit to show to the people. And in a later pasuk, there's an explicit mention. They say, and here's the fruit of the land. But it is also interesting to ask why the Torah would say these fruits in particular. One thing you can notice about them is that they're all fruits included in a longer list, which we call Shivat Haminim, the 7 fruits of the land of Israel. That you have the grains of wheat and barley, pita and silra, and then you have dvash or tamar, like the date, and you have shemen or zayit, for the oil or from the olive, and so that gets you 4. And then the other 3 that make the 7 are these ones we've already mentioned: rimon, anavim, and te'anim. So pomegranates, grapes, and figs. So it's interesting already to say, okay, so we have this longer list, and this is the Torah telling us something that happens that is supposed to have meaning for all time about what is being shown to them about the land. And we wouldn't know it would have batted an eye if in this moment the scouts somehow managed to gather up all 7 of Shivat Haminim. They brought wheat and barley and some olives or oil or whatever, and also some dvash or some tamarim, and then in addition these other fruits. no one would say that's surprising. They'd say, oh, yeah, of course, these are the fruits of the land. And we say elsewhere, these are the fruits of the land. So it's always consistent and it makes sense. But this is a subset of these fruits that's being focused on. And as we mentioned, it might just be seasonal, but it's more interesting to suppose that the theory of why the Torah is telling us this has more meaning to convey to us. So what I want to ask is, why grapes, pomegranates, and figs? What is it that those three fruits have to show us together about, let's say, what the people are considering as they're weighing the decision to go into the land, and what they eventually do there? And so you can start to analyze these three fruits a little bit and ask, what do they have in common? What's different about them? So I think one of the things that's interesting, just think about the fruit itself, is that all three of these fruits they kind of sit on a spectrum of separateness or unifiedness of the individual seeds that they produce. So on one side of the spectrum, you have grapes, like a bunch of grapes. A bunch of grapes is like each separate grape is its own fruit, generally with one seed or a small number of seeds inside. And it's hanging on a big cluster, and they're all very distinct and separate. And then in the middle, you have the limon, and we'll go back to the limon, but if you go to the other end of the spectrum, there's the fig. The fig just looks like one fruit. But then if you cut open a fig and you look closely, because of the way the flower has closed, you see all these little seeds, and there's this feeling that like a whole bunch of different separate pieces have been joined together in this one whole that's all wrapped in this one skin. So in the grape cases, in the case of the grapes, every single seed has kind of its own little globe of skin around it. And in the case of the figs, there's this one skin that surrounds the whole fruit, and then there's like the tiny little individuals that are almost indistinguishable, but have been sort of merged together into this closed flower that you see when you look inside the fruit of the teina, of the fig. And then in between is the limon, the pomegranate. And the pomegranate is very much a balance between these two ideas, because on the one hand, there is this single flower enclosing skin type thing that happens with limon. You really can see how the flower kind of closes up and produces a fruit that is this whole embracing thing. But then when you open up the limon, there's tons and tons of seeds, and they have each their own kind of membranous skin that is containing the juicy pulp inside. So like they each are like their own separate fruit. It's this feeling that somehow it's like there's the skin that encloses the whole, but then it's like as though they're little tiny grapes inside the pomegranate that have all been sort of jammed together into this unified arrangement. And so there's very much the sense of, on the one hand, having distinct individuality of the fruits, and at the same time, unification into a shared whole. And so it's a little bit interesting to note this, but you could take it or leave it and say maybe that's just sort of a coincidence. But I think we can dig a little bit more now and say, okay, what else do these different fruits point to, and what else do they have kind of in common that we could pull out, where we could see a little bit more what the Torah maybe trying to talk to us about? So another thing that's notable is that they each in their way elsewhere in the Torah are associated with some kind of trade-off between clothing and nakedness. So te'enim, figs, are mentioned first in the Torah because they are the plant that supplies the leaves in the Garden of Eden, in Gan Eden, where Adam and Chava are going to use leaves of the fig to cover their nakedness once they realize that they're naked and they need to be clothed. So there's this association of the te'enim with clothing of nakedness, and that makes sense because if you think about the teina, if you think of the individuals that we mentioned that are inside the teina, inside the fruit of the fig, they're kind of surrounded by this whole skin or this whole garment or whatever, and then closed. And then grapes are also associated with nakedness in Torah early on, because Noah plants a vineyard and then he gets drunk and then he's naked in his tent. And so there you have, instead of the idea of covering up with nakedness, you have kind of the exposure of nakedness, that Noah's naked because he's drunk. So the grapes are associated with nakedness in kind of a failure to cover up sense. And indeed, the grapes are at that opposite end of the spectrum, where it's sort of like each individual fruit is just out in the open, and there isn't a sense of overall enclosure to the group. And then the last way that we can identify connection to clothing and nakedness, in the case of the rimon, in the case of the pomegranate, is that rimonim are associated with the garments worn by the Kohen Gadol, for example, right? The bigdei kehuna, the garments, the clothing worn by the high priest in the temple. They're supposed to be these little crafted metal rimonim that are on the hem, and that are part of this sort of arrangement with rimonim and pamonim, like of pomegranates and bells, basically in order that the whole thing makes noise as he walks. And so the pomegranate also is associated with clothing, but now it's associated with clothing in this very godly way, where it's clothing performing a function in the context of a service of Hashem, Avodat Hashem. And so that certainly, as far as the branding that we're achieving by comparing to, on the one hand, the story of the sin in Eden and the covering up of nakedness, or Noah getting drunk with his grapes and then being found naked, those both seem sort of much like more embarrassing failure modes in their association with clothing. And the rimon is different. It stands apart because it sounds more like a success. A rimon is appearing in a context where clothing is not being used to cover nakedness for its own sake or out of embarrassment, or because someone made a mistake. It's part of bigdei kehuna. It's part of a uniform that someone is donning in order to serve Hashem. And that in its own way, I think, becomes a comment on kind of the purpose of clothing, where we're thinking now of clothing as being the enclosure of the fruit. Because, and this is, I think, maybe it's a little bit strange to push for this, but this is the one brief comment I wanted to make on this, since we're, as I mentioned, in the tail end of the season where we are picking these fruits and enjoying them here in Eretz Yisrael. That I think it may be a statement in a sense about political order, that the people are looking at the land and they're looking at the possibility of entering the land and becoming a nation, and they're going to have to, as they become a nation, not just be individuals, but also be a group that has some kind of system of political order that they're a part of. And the question is, what kind of political order does the Torah recommend for us? And there are different ways of going too far or failing in one direction or another that are being laid out here. Because on the one hand, the grapes are capturing an end of the spectrum that has to do with, let's say, rampant individuality, right? So you just have like each separate grape is on its own, and yes, you can form a mob. Like there's a bunch of grapes, they're all together, and so it's not as though individuals only are always kind of isolated, but the degree of coordination and the degree of like coherent purpose of what they're a part of, that is represented as being somewhat limited. And so it's just sort of a mob that you can get to stampede in one direction or another, but most of the time you have rampant individuality that isn't grounded in some kind of purpose that binds everyone together. That's like one direction that political order can go in. Another direction political order can go in is the opposite extreme. That's more sort of like Mitzrayim, right? Where there's like one whole and everyone is subservient to that whole. So much so that like the individual seeds are almost kind of annihilated and dissipate or subsumed into that whole. And you just have like the whole thing, the individual is erased. And what matters is the entire collective purpose, and individuals are insignificant. And that, in the conception of Tanakh, you could say that's like Mitzrayim, or that's Bavel, right? You have Migdal Bavel, you have the Tower of Babel, and actually there's, well, I won't go on a tangent, but Migdal Bavel is a story that takes the idea of unity and plays with it, a unified project. You have all this notion of everyone's organized around one collective project. There's a midrash that, when they were building the Tower of Babel, they would weep when a brick fell off, but not when a person fell off. Like that, there's this devaluation of the individual life, and it's all about the sort of the project we're building together. And we also think about Mitzrayim that way, right? That Paro is this God king, and he's the head, and what matters is that everyone is doing for Paro what he commands them to do, and the pyramid is like, the king at the top is standing on top of this whole structure of people who are obeying him below. And you see that in other kind of imperial ancient arrangements, maybe like in Chinese dynasties as well. And so that kind of an extreme is one that the Torah seems, from these connotations that we've been stirring up, maybe also to have a problem with, like that the Te'ena is not ideal in the way that the Enav is not ideal. So on the one hand, individualism, unconstrained, with just different sort of stampedes of individuals, represented by the bunch of grapes. You have this kind of failure mode with sin and nakedness, and then also there's a similar association with sin and nakedness in the case of the Te'ena, in the case of the fig. And so you don't have this feeling of like endorsement from the Torah for this kind of a model. And then in between is the Rimon. And in the case of the Rimon, with this association with a Bigdei Kyona, I think that is what it's trying to locate as like the Judaic ideal for the balance between these two things, where you both need to have a national whole that is like enclosed, that it has like a purpose that embraces all the individuals into one thing. But at the same time, also you have the very well-defined and separate individuals within that have their own agency and their own significance, and you're not going to erase them. You're not trying to stamp them out. So on the one hand, they're not this uncoordinated set of individuals that's all kind of flying in different directions. And on the other hand, you're not trying to subsume them into one thing and say they don't matter. That the value of the individual, I think people rightly feel, now the Western world is now considered to be the ideological wellspring of individualism. However, I think people rightly argue that the championing of individualism is something that the West learned from its biblical heritage to some degree, that like the significance of each individual human life is something that in part came from the Hebrew Bible and all that brought into the thing of the West. Now, obviously, Western ideas, it's a much more complicated melange of different things coming from different sources, and also the radical individualism of the present day West is something that you have to wonder if it's starting to go in like the grape crunch direction. But we do have this notion of like each person being made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and that means that you can't stamp out and erase boundaries between individuals. But then there's this sense of like, where is the limitation of that? Like, where does individualism stop, and what does it have to be combined with in order to make the national project at a political level or a social level a success? And what the Rimon is signifying is that has to do with the big day kionah, the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, the service of Hashem. That the service of Hashem is what binds us together. And so, yes, we're a bunch of different separate individuals, but we're part of this thing that represents Avodat Hashem. And I think, by the way, this is also related to another famous comment by Chazal, where they say that the number of seeds in the rimon, in the pomegranate, is 613, which is the number of mitzvot. And I don't think that means that Chazal did a statistical analysis where they took a bunch of rimonim and counted all the seeds and found that that was the average. I certainly can believe there might be that number of seeds in some rimonim and maybe more or fewer in others. But by saying that, I think Chazal were making the point, certainly, that the rimon somehow acts as this talisman for, like, what is the idea of all of these mitzvot? What is it for? What does it do? And the point is that the mitzvot are the structure of ideas and injunctions and regulations and suggestions and opportunities and commandments and what have you, that create this framework to embrace all the individuals of the nation into one thing that has a common purpose, which is Avodat Hashem. And so I think, obviously, ultimately, this isn't something that implies a very specific set of political procedures. It's not like a written constitution saying there should be a bicameral legislature with whatever. It's a much higher level way of talking about this and thinking about it in terms of fruit. But I do think that it's a good jumping off point for thinking about what kind of a polity Israel are being encouraged to have in their own land, because the idea that the liberty of individuals trumps everything else, and that, like, what we need to do is just create a sort of free playing field for individualism that doesn't expect any kind of coordinated purpose from the whole. The idea that in that sense that, Am Yisrael should seek to have yet another Western liberal democracy that only defines itself or justifies itself to its people in those terms. It's sort of providing for and protecting the rights of individuals. That seems to be something that the Torah is saying that would go too far in a certain direction, although we prize and care about individuality. And similarly, if you just said, oh, well, okay, so we have a national project as a whole and nothing else matters, and we'll grind individuals into the dust to make it work, that also would go too far in another direction. But the happy medium and the balance point that the Torah identifies in between is saying, we are a Mamlechet Kohanim, we're a nation that's meant to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in order to serve him, we have to be lots of separate individuals with different opinions and different talents and different proclivities and different preferences and all of those things. And they matter, and they aren't to be discounted, they aren't to be erased, and they aren't to be dissolved or eliminated. But there is, at some level, also meant to be a kind of a coordination and a unification where we say, let's try to find a way of bringing that whole am of individuals together, so that part of what our individualism is for is participating in this broader project that embraces us all, which is to find a way to serve Hashem as individuals and as a nation working together. So one of the words that I was thinking about, the concepts I was thinking about as you were speaking, is the concept of libertarianism. That there have been certain group or groups who have been trying to push Israel in a more libertarian direction. Moshe Feiglin is known for that. On the other hand, it could be that what he's advocating is essentially a combination of
the individual and the national as you were describing, as one of the options. The combination of that, because he even in his platform, his philosophy, it's basically it's a type of Jewish libertarianism, but so it's not absolute individualism. It's to be balanced. It's libertarianism only to the extent that it doesn't contradict Jewish values or Jewish identity.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting by contrast when you think about libertarianism, I don't know, in America or somewhere like that. The discussion very often is challenging if you pick at it philosophically, because it's sometimes hard to pin people down as, you know, what was the answer to the question? Is libertarianism a practical recommendation that gets you the results that you want, or is it a moral principle that gets you the results you want by definition? So, because one kind of libertarianism, more sort of along the lines of Milton Friedman, when you are talking with him about details or something, is just that a lot of things, when you apply libertarian principles to them, can more easily flourish. Like that we make the mistake of thinking that we can fix a lot of social and economic problems by intervening with rules, but actually very often giving individuals the opportunities to use their own information and make their own decisions comes up with outcomes that maybe, you know, produce more wealth, or there's less distortion of prices or supplies or what have you, you know. And so that kind of like Friedman, Hayek kind of argument for libertarianism, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and you see a lot of examples where that's the case. And so there is a kind of just a practical argument of, in a lot of cases, a certain amount of libertarianism of like getting out of the way and letting free individuals make decisions. You can diffuse information through a market better and oftentimes get a better result. I think that, I mean, I don't want to speak for Moshe Feiglin. I suspect that to some degree he probably would incline more in that direction, only in the sense that, well, he is not going to be someone who says, I'm a libertarian to such a degree that individual liberty trumps the Torah. Like, he doesn't take that position. If you ask him, he would say the Torah trumps other things. And so where the Torah disagrees with radical, you know, individual liberty, you would go with the Torah. And so I suspect he would be someone who would point out the practical value of thinking in libertarian terms and critiquing things from a libertarian perspective in a lot of cases, and saying like, oh, do we really want dairy products to be produced and sold in the way that they are, you know, in the state of Israel? Or could there be a different way that might lead to lower prices and higher quality and fewer shortages and, you know, whatever else? And so you can do that kind of thing. Although he might also say that he thinks that Torah, in many cases, is in favor of libertarian principles, and like, because the Torah is, that we should be learning that from the Torah. But yeah, like there are people who are more radically libertarian, and very often, you know, in a way where they make an idol out of it, if you're looking at the American context, and they want to say basically, whatever happens once you know, give individuals as much liberty as possible to make their own decisions, that is the world that it is good to have. And there's no arguing about like, well, it would have been better if we'd done something different. Whatever you get from that condition is by definition the morally best outcome, because you've maximized liberty. And I think viewed through the lens of Torah, that's clearly a simplistic idolatry. But I don't think that the Torah therefore says, so wherever you feel like you want to garnish liberty a little bit, just go ahead and do that, because it's too extreme or something to be libertarian. The Torah is, it is sometimes libertarian and sometimes anti-libertarian and 100% correct, but I think that you could still say about it that it leaves a lot of room for individual choice and freedom, and that seems to be a very strong value in it. So yeah, I don't know. I think that it wouldn't be fair to say that the Torah teaches libertarianism, but I think what people sometimes say in the reverse is wrong. I don't think the Torah teaches like statism or socialism or any of these other kind of isms of the 20th century by any stretch. And we're certainly being taught, in the example I'm trying to argue from the fruit, that there's some kind of balance to be had where you have affirmation of individualism, but then something that kind of binds everyone together. The last thing I'll just say is I don't know if that's only a consideration with respect to liberty per se. Like, individualism isn't just about liberty, it's also about identity. It's about in the extreme where you don't have any liberty, I guess it's hard to express differences in identity, but the point is it's also about like whether people feel like they're supported to be different from each other, or whether they're discouraged from being different from each other, or whether they are whether the things that make them unique are kind of celebrated, or whether they are ignored, or like people try to eliminate them. And those are all things that vary from society to society.
I was also thinking that in certain libertarian ideals might work more and be more necessary in the current cultural or climate, or within the current the framework of the current ethos of many Jews, whereas sometime maybe in 200 years from now, when Jews have a very different, perhaps will have a very different mentality than what they have today, then it'll be less relevant. And for example, when it comes to questions of neighborhoods, for example, which are almost completely secular, it may be much more productive to operate according to a libertarian principle right now, because that simply will work. Whereas in a situation where 80% of the people are already quite religious in the country, it might not be the most necessary modus vivendi.
Yeah, well, I mean, once you get down to the level of neighborhoods, also, people talk about libertarianism as whether it's really something that you should think about as being more important to apply in your approach to politics, the bigger the thing you're talking about is. Like, are you making laws about a whole country, or are you making rules for a street? Because generally we accept more kinds of specific constraints on how we operate when it starts to get down to the level of families or neighborhoods or things that are small, because people like to do certain things their way. Like, you can get people in a city or in a neighborhood or whatever to agree on certain rules about how buildings can be built, and it can be nice that they're all the same color, or that they all have to be different colors, or whatever else. And I think that, like, real estate is a great way of appreciating that sometimes rules that coerce people to some degree create shared spaces or atmospheres that sometimes people want. And if people want to get together in a compact and say, like, all right, let's all get together and make a sort of little territory where we say these are the rules for how you build buildings, it's hard to argue that that's always just like the greatest evil, and you want everyone to always be able to do whatever they want in their home, as their castle, or whatever. But it becomes much more clearly a bad idea to make one rule for everyone when it's, pertaining to millions of people stretched over many territories, many cities or many states or what have you. And So I think maybe this is a little bit of a tangent, but it reminds me actually. I think it's in Masechet Bava Batra. There's a discussion of something that struck me as a very non-libertarian economic regulation that we get from Chazal, which is talking about like the idea of a shuk, where you have a market, and someone is, let's say they're selling cherries or some fruit. We're back to the fruit again. So they have like a fruit stall in the market. And then someone else comes along and sets up a fruit stall right next to them, selling the same fruit for a lower price. And in that instance, you could say that this new guy with a new fruit stall who's just underbidding the guy right next to him, he's actually doing something wrong because he's just like trying to take away the livelihood of the guy selling fruit right next to him. And that's a very non-libertarian economic regulation, because an economic libertarian would just say, no, I mean, of course you want competition because that will lower the price for consumers. And if everyone competes all the time, like people will find ways of participating in the market. And like if my fruit stall goes out of business because of your fruit stall, then I'll go do something else. And it's good for everyone for me to be doing something else because you're going to get that fruit that's cheaper, and I'm going to do something else with my time that, you know, allows me to create value that I don't have to, waste time selling expensive fruit. But there is an aspect of that story, which is kind of like the Milton Friedman version of the story. There's an aspect of that story that hides a bit of the cruelty of like saying, okay, if I come right next to you and I set up a fruit stall right next to yours, I'm driving you out of business. Maybe it's good for the consumer that they're getting cheaper fruit. And maybe also, once you find a new profession, you could argue that it was all for the best. But in the short term, there's a lot of destruction and pain and fear and that are being caused by the fact that I'm making it so that a way you made your living no longer is available to you. And I puzzled over that. I remember when learning it, because I kind of, especially at the time, was inclined to notice the more kind of libertarian aspects of, let's say, the teachings of Chazal or the Torah. Like, for example, that still talking about fruit, we are much, the Torah certainly has things that are provisions to give food to the poor, but a lot of them are very passive, like with not picking the corners of your field or not retrieving things that fall off your cart or not beating the trees. So there's a sense of like trying to leave some things that are out there for people. But there isn't, which is to say that there seems to be a preference to some degree for the Torah, where possible, to do redistribution in a way that doesn't start by having the government go around and like take everyone's stuff and get it together in a big pot and then hand it out again. That you have to kind of like leave it in the field, so to speak, as much as possible, and leave it close to the individuals who are making decisions about what to do. But if you look at, so if you look at this fruit stall thing, it sounds like it's a very anti-libertarian regulation. But I think that the caveat that you would apply is that it cares about locality, which gets back to this thing we were saying about neighborhoods before. That it's true that you can say to someone, okay, you can't like set up a fruit stall right next to someone else and run them out of business. But it doesn't mean that like you're responsible for not selling fruit because, there's another fruit stall that exists in the world somewhere that maybe is selling fruit for a higher price. So the proximity matters. Like if you go right to the same place in the market and set up next to him, then maybe you could say, okay, you're trying to destroy this guy's livelihood. But if you, sell on a different market day or at a different location or whatever, in the same vicinity, it's less the case that it can be argued that you're directly trying to destroy someone's livelihood. And so I think that the balance that Halacha strikes there is caring about like how local this is. And I think that is a pretty common principle that you see, where like the more this is about you and your neighbor or you and your family, the more like there is kind of the possibility that halacha is in favor of things that look like coercion, or that look like you're not just simply free to do what's best for you, and you have to kind of take into account the people around you, and be constrained by them, and maybe be expected to coordinate with them in some way. And that is, not what you get from, I don't know, Ayn Rand or something. But I think there is obviously a much greater aspect of humanism in that bounded libertarianism, because there are ways for you to connect with other people in your neighborhood, in your family, in your nation, and coordinate with them, that kind of save you from the isolation of pure individuality.
It also crossed my mind. I was thinking about that during the current election campaign. Shas was making a big point of showing how they were the socially oriented party, and so I don't know exactly what they were referring to, but if they were talking about something along giving out food stamps, then the question emerges sort of related to what you were saying before. Maybe perhaps the Torah would prefer a situation of not forcibly taking money from the rich and then redistributing it to the poor via the government, but perhaps letting a very vibrant nonprofit sector work, where the nonprofit organizations take care of getting money to people who are in need. In any case, regardless of whatever is the correct balance between government action in this regard and non-government nonprofit organizations activity in this regard, it would seem that what's always important is to keep tabs on what the reality is on the ground. In other words, not relying on what they call, I remember that when Reagan was in power, I think that there were people that called Milton Friedman's ideas of voodoo. Was it voodoo capitalism or something like that?
Voodoo economics, maybe.
Voodoo economics, right? So I think that anything can become an avodah zarah. The assumption of itself that you just let everybody, let the economy be totally free and everything work itself. I don't think there's any that could also become a type of idolatry. There's no need to assume one can go, one can, the emphasis can be on letting the nonprofit organizations take care of the poor. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying attention to see if it's actually working. And in the event that under a certain set of circumstances, for whatever the reason it's not working, then the government might need to intervene. I think I think it's within the framework of Judaism, there's the obvious need to pay attention to what the reality is on the ground.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think the thing that I've seen in Chumash that maybe starts to hint at that aspect of it is in Stom V'Amorah, like this episode where Lot is bringing his guests, because Chazal have taught us that the problem with Stom was that they banned tzedakah, they banned giving of charity. But the question is, how did they ban giving of charity? Like, what was the problem exactly? How do you ban giving of charity? Because one way of banning giving charity is you go and you find people who are giving away things and you try to punish them. But it also is an issue of, if you create a situation where the entire economy is under supervision and control, then there's no such thing as charity anymore, because no one has anything that belongs to them to give. So there is this kind of like Bolshevik version of reading Stom, where the problem in a sense is that the people, with a capital P, believe it's their right to know and keep track of and control everything that goes on in stone. And that is not so far from the surface of the text, because you have this description. First of all, there's the verb leda'at that's being used, like to know, and we usually rush straight to like they want to rape the visitors of Lot, because leda'at et can refer to sexuality. Although interestingly, there's at least one instance in the Torah where it's not clear that it does, because that's used in the description of the relationship between Yosef and Paro. So unless you want to read sexuality into that relationship, I was just taking things in a different direction. It isn't always the case that the Torah is talking about sexuality when it uses the da'at et. And so when the people of stone come, there's an explicit description that it's like young and old, and great and small, right? That there's everyone is there, all the people. There's this emphasis on the idea of like a mass democratic event where 100% of them are all sort of voting for this, so to speak, and they're demanding to know. Like they're saying the people demand to know about these guests and what's going on with Lot and his guests, and what he's giving to them. And so more maybe has to be done to build up, whether you buy that this is partly about economics, but we do have suggestion from Chazal that this is the case. But the point I wanted to make is that the people, the polity as a whole in stone, when they're searching, right, they're blinded by sinvarim, by the sort of dazzling lights of the malachim, and they can't find the door to Lot's house. And to me, one of the things that seems to be hiding in the background there is that there's something that's quite blind about the body politic as a whole. Like if you try to get them to do something as a whole, then there's a lot that they don't know, because actually individuals know things, and the collective knows much less, because it has much less of an ability to sort of codify and distribute information in a way that integrates all the different things that could be known by individuals. And this is Hayek's critique, which became Milton Friedman's critique of highly regulated markets, that when you try to do things like fixed prices, or when you try to do things like tell people when they can or can't buy things or what have you, you don't have enough information to do that in a way that lines up with how much is actually demanded of something and how much can be supplied and how difficult it is to get it from A to B and all these other things. And so prices are this way for a lot of information to get from one place to another, and for people to make decisions with good information. And if you don't let prices convey that information, then you get big economic problems of various kinds, like shortages or what have you. And so I think there is this element of, part of the problem is like whenever you ask the government to do something, the government doesn't do things. People do things at the behest of the government. And there are many situations in which, once you have a highly regulated or very incorporated governmental body trying to do things, it will lack information and not be able to do it as well as a result. And that was relentlessly the argument of people like Hayek and Friedman, that I think is just a piece of chokhmah that's very universal. It's not like Torah per se, but I think it applies to human affairs in general. But I think that the malachim in this episode in stone, it seems so clear to me that like when the mob can't even find the door to Lot's house because they're somehow so unified as a whole in their approach to this situation that they certain details are just invisible to them. That seems to be something that's not so far from the surface of the text there. And I think that goes back to this issue of giving it tzedakah, that giving it tzedakah ideally is done individual to individual, because part of the mitzvah of giving tzedakah, and this is like an established thing in halacha, is to know that the person who's getting tzedakah really needs it, right? Like someone could, a complete spoiler, could just like be a millionaire or whatever and decide to dress up and like go around and panhandle and get some extra money. I mean, that's like a very absurd situation to imagine. But the point is that if that happened, it wouldn't be to your merit that you're giving money to this person who doesn't need it and isn't actually deserving of tzedakah. And so that creates the onus on the person giving tzedakah to have some reason to think that he's actually successfully performing the mitzvah. But when you collectivize that act, you have, again, big problems with the flow of information. Like everyone sends their money to the government, and exactly by what process that money goes back out to people who need it is somewhat opaque and probably like horribly bureaucratically inefficient, and certainly not all the money gets spent on things that really could be called tzedakah, right? Like, is paying for television advertising of Bituach Leumi tzedakah, or is it like, you know, something else? Like they have a budget and they spend some of their money on that. So clearly there are those who would say, well, but if you don't use the government, that like the government solves a collective action problem, and they would try to argue that it makes certain things more efficient or gets people to give tzedakah who wouldn't otherwise give it. But I think that's a very contentious claim, and you could easily make the case instead that if a society wants to be generous and help people in need, they don't need to be coerced into doing that by the government. Like if you let them keep their money instead of paying it in tax, they will give some of their money to help people in need. And that maybe they'll do a better job doing that because they will take more of an individual interest in it and be able to act like consumers and ask whether this like private organization that they're supporting is really doing a good job helping people. And that will create a much more vigorous market for, you know, providing for helping the needy, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think there's definitely room to argue that from the standpoint of Torah, maybe, you know, very centralized and kind of socialist arrangements like we have in the state of Israel might not necessarily be ideal halachically. But, you know, that being said, it's also certainly the case that some people do get helped by these mechanisms. And so one does hope that in the current situation that some of the income that goes to those kinds of things can be counted as tzedakah.
I was thinking that what you were saying about the benefit of local tzedakah having more of a sense of what people need as compared to some sprawling bureaucracy. It also that also can apply in a different type of way. It's not only in terms of the giver, that the local organization might have a better sense of who the actual poor people are, but it also may be that the poor people themselves are less inclined to lie about their situation to somebody they know locally as opposed to some faceless government.
Yeah, of course. I mean, once a government policy is in place, I think people much more so treat it as everyone has to just do the best they can to get along by taking advantage of the opportunities that are available to them. And even if no one's doing anything improper, it can still be the case that someone, you know, a large number of people will be kind of benefiting from an existing policy for reasons that are different than what it was originally created for, because you just get that when millions of people are all kind of optimizing their situation in a policy framework that's been established around them.
I mean, I was also thinking about if we take an example of a person who has permanent physical handicaps, or let's say a person who is I don't know, 70 or 80% if we can put it that way, incapable of functioning physically. So is it better for the government to provide that type of person with a permanent stipend, or would that also be better, ideally, to have that done on the local level?
Yeah, I mean, it starts to enter into considerations that are very specific to the case. And I think what the interesting thing to me is just there's a lot that we can learn from halakha and from our tradition and how we approach these issues. And I don't think that means that halakha provides a ready-made handbook for how to write laws in the present day. There's a lot you can do now with technology and other things that present certain kinds of opportunities. So you need to come up with solutions that are like appropriate to the present moment. But it does seem like there's trying to really understand how these things are understood in the tradition and say, like, what is the wisdom in that? And also, how do we figure out which way is up? Like, where do our standards come from for what a success looks like? I think there's really an argument for that. Like, even just like the word tzedakah, what's interesting is that it does appear a few times in the Torah itself. But I mean, especially maybe the most striking appearance with respect to this particular issue is there's this case that's described of a individual who's borrowed money and from their creditor, and they have as collateral they've given their garment as some kind of collateral or pledge, and there's this mitzvah. So it says, "Hashiv tashiv lo et ha'avot kevo hashemesh v'shachav besalmato uve'orcheka ulecha tihyeh tzedakah lifnei Adonai Elohecha." So, in principle, he's given you as some kind of collateral this garment of his. But the point is, you can't say, well, you owe this to me until you give me back my money, because he needs something to sleep in, so you have to give it to him so that he can sleep in it, and then he'll give it back to you in the morning. And then this action is called tzedakah. And what's interesting, I don't know, there's several things that are interesting about it. One of them is that it's not a sort of transfer of a good that just goes one way. In that sense, it's different than like Maaser Sheni or something like that. It's not just like a tithe from your income where you say, like, I have this much wealth and I'll take a chunk of it, I'll give it to someone else. The actual case where the word tzedakah is used in the Torah is it's talking about a kind of a consideration between individuals who are they're already entangled in this agreement where someone has loaned someone else money, and that is not being resolved at this moment. And now there's this question of what you do with the collateral. If the collateral is someone's like bedclothes or whatever, do you like refuse to let them have it at night or something? Or do you just hold on to it during the day but give it back to them at night? So there's this kind of this emphasis on the decency between individuals who already in other ways are transacting or sort of entangled or involved with each other. And obviously that kind of character to the interaction is the first thing that just gets erased by centralization of helping those in need, right? Because that kind of consideration cannot be shown by a large institution because it would immediately be exploited, right? There's no way you can tell a giant organization handling millions or billions of shekels or dollars or whatever that you should just like let people have their collateral back whenever they want it, because then a certain percentage of them will just like default on the loan and run away because you did that. And by the numbers, you're just creating a situation that invites people to abuse a faceless system. But when it's between individuals, that becomes the meaning of tzedakah, is to show that kind of consideration in the lashon of the Torah itself. And I find that very striking.
Okay, so thank you for all your time, Dr. England, and looking forward to seeing you next time. And Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Thank you.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.